In 1915, director D.W. Griffith released Birth of a Nation. Based off Confederate apologist novel The Klansman, the movie is a 3-hour epic spanning several years in the lives of two fictional, important white families, one in the North and one in the South, as they navigate the years of Reconstruction after the Civil War, portrayed in the film as a time of chaos and social destruction, the result of out-of-touch Northern policies being carelessly grafted onto communities where they were doomed to fail. And yes, by policies I do mean ending slavery. Today, Birth of a Nation is most famous for being one of the most transparently racist films ever made. Its portrayal of black people as vengeful, shiftless opportunists, hardly better than animals, is driven home by an extended sequence where a good Southern girl flings herself off a cliff rather than be raped by a black man, naturally played by a white man in blackface, who is later righteously lynched by the Klan. As this scene would imply, the horrors of miscegenation is a constant theme in this movie, the birth of a nation referring to the eventual marrying of the children of the two white families from opposite sides in a symbol of peace and reconciliation literally presided over by Jesus Christ himself. The problem, says the film, the source of all America's conflicts isn't our various ideological or geographical differences or politics. We're all the same, don't you see? The real problem is black people, helped along by the Northern inability to recognize how crucial it is that white people defend their Aryan birthright as a unified whole. Birth of a Nation is a disgusting movie in every way. It was also a smash success that solidified the public acceptance of film as a legitimate art form, defined the grammar of filmmaking, and arguably marked the emergence of the film industry as we know it today. At the same time, it was also a huge inspiration for the creation of the Second Ku Klux Klan, which lynched and terrorized their way through the early 20th century with the benefit of this new smash hit that portrayed them as heroes. But there's one detail about Birth of a Nation that I think is more disturbing than all the racism surrounding it, which, though disgusting, was really nothing new. And it's that D.W. Griffith himself was not a pro-Confederate activist. He wasn't a Klan member, he wasn't outspoken about white supremacy, and in fact later made what's considered the first mixed-race romance on film, though Broken Blossoms is all sorts of racist on its own. He was racist beyond any doubt, but more in the average turn-of-the-century rich white guy way than the wearing sheets and burning crosses way. D.W. Griffith, more than anything, just really didn't seem to care much about race. For him, the point was to tell a grand and epic tale through film. Being a very talented businessman, he knew this one was likely to sell, and in true capitalist fashion considered financial success the most important marker of a story's goodness. In fact, his fifis got so hurt by liberals and black people of the day calling for a boycott of Birth of the Nation that he put together a series of pamphlets titled The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America, where he compares himself to Socrates and Joan of Arc, and then he sunk a bunch of money into making a whole new epic called Intolerance. Nominally, Intolerance is a sort of swooning, grief-stricken thesis about human intolerance over the ages, but scholars basically accept that the inspiration for it was being bummed that some people thought his movie was bad and didn't like how it inspired people to be race terrorists. All I said was that black people are the common enemy we should unite against. When are we going to stop letting our good faith ideas be canceled by the woke mob? Now you might be wondering what I'm doing talking about Birth of a Nation in a video about race horror, and that's a reasonable wonder to have. Birth of a Nation is horrific, but it's not really horror, and I promise you we'll get there. But first we have to talk about Get Out. 102 years after Birth of a Nation, comedian and filmmaker Jordan Peele made a movie about a black guy who was preyed upon by a rich white family who, unbeknownst to him, is trying to literally steal his talent in photography and graft it onto a white guy. Like Birth of a Nation, it was controversial, and like Birth of a Nation, it was a smash success. That was 5 years ago, and since then race has turned into the subject of choice for Hollywood studios looking to cash in on the new prestige horror trend. Race horror is now its own brand, a horror genre specifically about the history of race in America and its lasting trauma. And on paper, I love this idea. Horror is always to some degree about injustice, which often goes hand in hand with marginalization, and no one in America has a better horror story to tell right now than non-white people, especially black people. However, something weird is happening with race horror. Despite a growing legitimization of horror as a genre, no shortage of interesting ideas, and very good funding, it seems like a lot of race horror being released is bad. Bad. It's quite bad. I will show you what I mean. I have prepared for you 3 reviews of race-themed horror movies. They have a few similarities. 1, they were all released in the past few years after Get Out. 2, they are all extremely skillfully made. All 3 are absolutely beautiful to look at. They're well acted, they're well directed. The filmmakers in all 3 cases were pretty obviously given a lot of room to make them the way they wanted to. That's typically a good thing, but we'll talk about it. 3, they were all made by relatively inexperienced writer-directors who have no apparent previous experience in the horror genre. Again, hiring new talent is typically a good thing, and again, we'll talk about it. 4, they are all quite hard to watch in a way that is somehow both nakedly brutalist and preachy at the same time. And that is because even though these movies are all nominally black horror, they were made for white people. They also have a couple of differences. 1, they were all made by different creative teams. The writers, directors, actors, producers, they're pretty much all different. And 2, they all take place during different time periods in American history. There is one more important similarity. The movies I'm going to talk about address the Black experience specifically, which matters because, I don't know if you've noticed, but I am not Black. I can't tell you what these movies should or do mean to Black audiences. I can and will tell you what they mean to me personally as a biracial Mexican cisgender human female. I also can and will tell you my thoughts as a horror scholar and media economist on why these movies exist and what function they're serving in the industry as a whole. In other words, why does race horror so often suck when it should be good? Is it the trans activists? I bet it's the trans activists. I hear they caused inflation. Okay, let's begin. Antebellum was released toward the end of 2020 after being pushed back a few times because of the pandemic. It was written and directed by Gerard Bush and Christopher Rentz and stars Janelle Monáe as a famous Black sociologist named Veronica, who wakes up one day apparently transported to an antebellum plantation and enslaved. There's no way to accurately talk about this movie or really any of these movies without spoiling them, so if you somehow missed the warning in the beginning and you care about spoilers, this is your signal to show yourself out. The plantation is actually an elaborate Civil War reenactment park for the racist Southern 1%. It's run by a senator who has generously provided this plantation for the proud sons of the Confederacy to relive the glory days where you could buy and sell people. That's a kick-ass premise. The problem, and it's a big problem, is that the fact of this basically being a modern-day theme park for white supremacists is presented as a twist. It isn't fully revealed until the literal last scene, which means that at the top of the movie, we get 45 full minutes of slavery torture, uncritical, decontextualized, just scene after scene of Black slaves being brutalized by sneering white monsters. Why am I watching this? What does this movie want me to get out of this? Could the lesson here truly be that slavery is bad? I get the feeling that Gerard Bush and Christopher Rentz don't particularly understand horror as a genre or the function that torture porn serves. There are 2 main audiences for torture porn: psychopaths, and to a much greater degree, thrill seekers, or the chronically anxious like me. I think the 2 are pretty closely related. It's a peek into the chasm, right? You're scratching the itch of an intrusive thought, like, this probably won't happen to me, but like, what if it did? The only time torture porn works is if you can process the thing you're seeing as implausible to the point of impossibility. You don't want to get too real because then you're crossing the line from entertainment to punishing the viewer. But slavery isn't impossible. It happened in exactly the way Antebellum is showing here. It's still happening. That's not thrilling. That's not cathartic. Why would I want to see that? So what's happened here is that the filmmakers, talented though they may be, didn't really know the recipe for what they were cooking. So when they tried to make torture porn, they made trauma porn instead. What's the difference? Well, and to be clear, this is my own definition, torture porn is purely physical, while trauma porn can be physical, but shocks the audience specifically by socially humiliating the subject. Rape and sexual assault scenes, for example, are trauma porn. Sexual violence has traditionally been one of the main factors that chases women and people on the more femme side of things away from horror. We think about the threat of assault often enough already. It's a daily consideration for us, so why would we get any catharsis from watching it happen on screen? We wouldn't. It's not for us, it's for men. Similarly, there's only one group of people for whom slavery could be at all considered an emotionally distant enough concept to thrill them instead of ruin their day, and that is white people. There is one alternative explanation, which is that this movie is not actually meant to thrill, it's meant to instruct, in which case I'll rephrase. There's only one group of people for whom the brutality of slavery might not be instantly obvious, and that is white people. So that's Antebellum. Before I move on though, allow me just a little bit of a digression. Gabourey Sidibe plays a friend of Veronica's named Dawn, and I love Gabourey. I love to see her get work, but Dawn is a huge bitch and I don't understand why she's written the way she is. There's this scene right before Veronica gets kidnapped where she and Dawn and their other rich and glamorous white scholar friend go to dinner, and the hostess tries to seat them at a table next to the kitchen, and Dawn absolutely goes off on her.
This table is 100% not acceptable, and I think that you know that, don't you? Becky. Listen, I'm actually not gonna go back and forth with you about exactly why this table is unacceptable. You're gonna seat us over there. Thank you so much, Rebecca. You're doing great.
Now, according to the grammar of filmmaking and the economy of writing, that all scenes and all dialogue should serve a purpose, either narrative or thematic, there are two possibilities for having included this. The first is that this is a character flaw of Dawn's that she will later have to answer for. Since Dawn disappears entirely from the movie about 10 minutes later, that leaves the other option that doesn't involve plain writing incompetence, which is that Dawn is wish fulfillment. She's a yas queen, applause from the filmmakers of non-white women who demand what they know they deserve. That's a rich enough character trait worth exploring, but this is a super weird way to do it. I don't know, I think it says a lot about how Gerard Bush and Christopher Rentz see the world that they think liberation means getting to verbally abuse and humiliate restaurant hosts. Them is a limited series released on Amazon in April of 2021 and was created by Little Marvin and produced by Lena Waithe, two talented and reasonably successful Hollywood figures with, again, no apparent prior experience in horror. It follows a black family in the 50s who move from North Carolina to LA after a tragedy that isn't revealed until the 5th episode. Dad, Henry, has gotten a traditionally white professional position as an engineer, allowing Mom, Lucky, and kids Ruby and Gracie to move to a white neighborhood. What they don't know is that the house they've bought was only available because it's haunted and no white families would buy it. At least that's my interpretation. It's honestly a little unclear. But whether I made it up or not, it's another kick-ass premise. Let's see how this pans out. The neighborhood white people, led by Ice Queen Betty, try their best to bully them out of town, and we see them gleefully spicing up their language with racial slurs.
And then that
real tough, huh?
There's a rape, there's a horrific baby murder, racial ostracization, harassment, maimings, and a whole extended sequence over several episodes where the show increasingly and inexplicably just becomes about Betty, and at the end nothing is resolved and the family is pretty much exactly where they were in the beginning. The haunting is gone, but they're still left to contend with the racism the ghost was supposed to symbolize in the first place. Great. There is one inspired subplot in this show that makes its overall failure feel even more tragic to me. The ghost haunting this house appears to each family member as a different entity, and to Henry it is what can only be described as a blackface monster. Like, not a sincere portrayal of minstrelsy, but more a portrayal of the spirit behind minstrelsy. Like an embodiment of how white people who do blackface imagine black people to be. Racial oppression always functions partly through fear. If you're a white racist, non-white people are scary not only because you've projected inherently evil qualities upon them, but also because you know deep down inside that you're giving them a very good reason to hate you.
A black man's heaven is a white man's what? Hell. Show you right.
Henry's ghost, named the Tap Dance Man, is the perfect example of what surrealist imagery can do. It's a spirit of righteous hate that is both parody and reality. A black actor performing a role invented by a racist white society and convincing Henry, its victim, that no matter who he thinks he is, a minstrel show is all he'll ever functionally be to the white people who essentially run his life. It's also the best engagement I've ever seen on film with why racial stereotyping is never and has never been harmless. That's always the argument, right? It's all in good fun. But who exactly is it good fun for, and why? Uh-oh. That bicycle horn means it's time for a clown tangent! If you've watched previous clown videos of mine and you are hip to the clown history scene, you know that there are a few different types of clown that tend to appear in pop culture. Sad clown, harlequin, fool. However, that list is not exhaustive. America made its own clown species in the mid-1800s with the invention of Minstrelsy, the first truly American theater style. It was a bizarro world sort of reflection of Italian commedia dell'arte with stock characters who largely played on themes of abuse and misfortune to make people laugh. Since America is supposed to be heaven on earth, we can't have white people doing that, so...
How would you like to go to work for me?
Yes, ma'am. How much you gonna pay me, I hope?
Blackface is a form of clownery. You're painting your face and acting like an idiot for the amusement of others. When someone performs in blackface, they're performing an entire culture, itself descended from slavery, poverty, and abject oppression, as a clown archetype. And that is why blackface is so singularly rotten and cursed. It's a human art form devoid of any of the empathy, insight, or self-reflection art typically comes from and is meant to inspire. Like, I can't stress enough what a distortion of theater blackface is. And I find that very scary, this use of human creativity toward purely evil purposes. The Tap Dance Man encapsulates all of that perfectly. Jeremiah Burkett's performance is incredible. It's scary without being overtly violent, the metaphor is accessible, and it rings true, this idea that being a non-white person in an overwhelmingly white environment means that even your anger has to be performed through white idioms, and resonates with me, and I'm only half a color. This has been today's Clown Tangent. For me, this raises a question. Why not just make a movie about this particular racialized experience? Why do we need to sift through 10 episodes of ugliness to get to a sophisticated idea? Well, again, it's because this show is made for white people. This is described really well in an absolutely savage review for Vulture by Angelica Jade Bastien. For the Los Angeles Times, Little Marvin addressed the show's particularly violent scenes, including Lucy's rape. What I've come to realize is that I wanted a scene that would rip through the screen, grab the viewer by the jugular, and force them to contend with a history of violence against Black bodies in this country. He said, if I did that in a way that you've seen before, like an act of police brutality or a slave narrative, that in some way creates a distance or a salve for a viewer. I've seen it before. But this is so abominable, it defies you to see it that way. But what viewer is Little Marvin trying to grab? What Black viewer would ever feel a sense of distance from the visual representation of police brutality or slavery? The use of the phrase Black bodies is galling here. The terminology, which gained a particular popularity in the wake of Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, often feels like a linguistic way to distance Black people from their humanity rather than shining a light on it. After all, violence doesn't happen against Black bodies in America, it happens toward Black people, affecting not just the flesh we live in, but our very psychology and those beautiful, complicated relationships we have with other Black folks in the world around us. Anyway, that's them. For a couple weeks after it came out, I genuinely thought it might spell the end of race horror as a subgenre. Despite its technical quality, it was not well received, and everyone I know who put themselves through it just seems a little sadder as a person, including myself. If you have a soul and you watched them, from the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry. Yet take heed, Ebenezer, we've but one shade left. Master came out a couple of months ago. It was written and directed by another relative newcomer, Mariama Diallo, and stars a few people doing a few things. Regina Hall is the new master of a student living house in a fictional Ivy League type elite university. This is a thing in universities like Yale and Harvard that have been around a few hundred years. The fancy student houses are headed by a faculty member who is called the housemaster, a title that has garnered some, I think, well-deserved criticism surrounding the sort of gross attachments of the word master to describe a position of authority. What classist and racist implications are we perpetuating by using that word in a context of the already extreme exclusivity on campuses that were built at the height of the slave trade, more often than not by slaves? Is it really a responsible terminology to use in that context, especially in an environment meant to facilitate the vulnerable transition from childhood to adulthood? Rich material to explore, perhaps, say in some kind of horror movie. But that's not what this movie is about. To be honest, it's a little bit difficult to pin down what this movie is about, sort of, by which I mean it's actually quite clear what this movie is about because it tells you in an extended monologue in the third act, like a rom-com.
You people so divorced from reality that you can't tell Black from white. That's what this place does. That's what happened to Jasmine. I know. It might not be white hoods and minstrels, but it's there. It's like a coast. You can't catch it. You can't prove it.
But let's pretend it doesn't and see what we've got. Master is a story about a black college freshman in this elite university and the alienation she feels being the only non-white person in sight, and how she deals with anonymous acts of racial harassment in her dorm room, which is maybe just someone being a racist asshole, maybe the result of witchcraft, and maybe the result of a black student who killed herself there in the 60s. It's not clear and never answered, and the student is found hanged in the room with half an hour of runtime left for Regina Hall to play out her own plotline concerning racist attitudes in the university at large. Master is an extremely frustrating movie. Like Antebellum and like them, it's stylistically beautiful. The acting is good, the cinematography is good, there are chapter headings between the scenes, which I think is a cool stylistic motif. It nails the stuffiness and lack of glamour in academia, which is more than I can say for Antebellum. Like, these ladies' outfits look like they're worth my entire yearly stipend. And it even has the only real joke that I could find in all three of these stories combined.
All of this tension at work and all of this, just everything going on is just really just in my body.
I think with you it's emotional.
Really, the problem is the same problem I've been harping on again and again here, which is that it isn't good horror. It's not scary, it's just aggravating. I deliberately included Master as an example here because unlike the other two, it's not an especially violent movie. All the deaths happen off screen, the only jump scares are weird maggot infestations. I don't think there's actually any blood at all, and yet it still somehow feels exploitative. There's no narrative motivation to any of the things that happen to any of the people in this movie. Really, what's happening here is a pretty straightforward list of grievances about the modern academic system acted out by talented performers with some mood lighting, like a high-budget theater group you hire for your corporate inclusivity seminar. So once again, it's worth asking who the audience is supposed to be here. I can't read the screenwriters' minds or tell you what their intentions were, but I can tell you that this movie says nothing about what it's like to not be white in academia that non-white academics don't already know. We know academia is racially exclusive as a result of past generational wealth and education. We know academia tokenizes non-white scholars. We know its only real response so far is to make committees so that everybody can talk in circles about it. We know. I think it's telling that most of the reviews for this one have been some version of, well, it's certainly got a lot on its mind. That's white critics, though. Non-white critics have been a little more pointed.
Usually, as a critic, I try to be fair and I try to be really thoughtful, but I feel like this is a moment where I have to have a Jay Sherman, the critic moment, where it's just like, it stinks. I hate it. I can see what it's trying to do, but it fails. And the way in which it fails is very symptomatic of the problems that filmmakers seem to be running into when they try to address these topics. Where I think this movie fails a lot is that it has so little empathy for its Black characters, in my opinion. And I think that that's really strange.
It's the weirdest.
It's so strange. Like the way that these Black women treat each other, the main three women.
Black women don't treat each other like that. It's weird.
They're so terrible to each other.
It's so weird.
It's almost like the movie is trying to make the argument that in this space, this is how Black women have to treat each other to survive. And it's like, I don't really believe that. I don't believe it because I've been in these spaces and most of this behavior makes no sense to me.
So after seeing these movies and others like them, the question I'm left with is, what the fuck is going on here? Let's return to the commonalities between these texts and see what we can suss out. 1, they were all released after Get Out. 2, they are all very visually artful, pretentious even. 3, established actors, unestablished directors who also at least co-wrote the script. 4, and hopefully I've pointed out enough evidence for this, the assumed audience is white. All of these are kind of related to each other, but let's start with the reason we're all here. Get Out was disruptive to the film industry in a way that Hollywood has been having to make up for ever since. In the past, if non-white people weren't being actively degraded, Hollywood got their woke points by having them function primarily as symbols for virtues that white culture was implied as lacking. Asians of all shades and cultures represented exoticism and adventure. Native Americans are environmentalists, not activists, though they need white people for that. Black people are spiritually wise. Latin people are just sex. That's pretty much it. We just fuck. Maybe every now and then we'll get something about what hard workers we are or whatever, but typically, to this day, if you see a Latina, like specifically a Latin woman of any national origin on screen, you know what you're in for, and what you're in for is a sex. Hilariously, since studios are all in a wokeness competition now, the Latina trope revamp is just kids' movies. Like, Latin people are so over-sexualized that the most revolutionary thing the industry could come up with is making us as sexless as possible. Anyway, what Get Out did was reveal the presumed white gaze Hollywood approached all its filmmaking with, both in a textual sense, since that's more or less what the movie is about, and in a metatextual sense, since the source of its controversy was the question of why Hollywood was making a movie about racialized pain, and by extension, why these really dark racial themes are generally so off limits in film. It was a serious gamble and absolutely would not have happened if A, Jordan Peele hadn't already been an established figure in the industry, and B, horror wasn't extremely cheap to make. Movie budgets can be hard to pin down, but all told, Get Out was probably made for under $5 million and grossed $250 million in theaters alone, in addition to being one of the very few horror movies to get Oscar attention, back when the Oscars still had a little bit of dignity.
Oh, wow!
What starts to happen after Get Out is a couple things, some convergences of talent and money that I think is bringing out the worst in everybody involved. One thing I think is happening is a general sort of disrespect to horror as a genre, both by the industry and by filmmakers. Horror is culturally seen as very lowbrow, even more so than pop entertainment like superhero movies, which, if they appeal to the working class, at least have noble themes. Film scholar Linda Williams categorizes horror as a genre of excess, by which she means a plot formula that works primarily with base emotional reactions. She puts horror in the same category as things like slapstick comedies, soapy melodramas, and porn. They make you laugh, they make you cry, you get it. Hollywood has traditionally relied on horror as a bill-paying device. They're generally cheap to make and they reliably turn a profit, even if they suck, because you can turn up stoned at the theater with your dorm buddies at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday and not miss much in terms of plot. We're in a prestige horror trend right now, but I think Hollywood is still in this mode of thinking good horror is easy to make. All you have to do is throw a bunch of money at a routine horror plot with politically relevant themes and you got yourself a cultural touchstone. Maybe you'll even win some very prestigious awards for it.
Oh, wow!
And this is the point where I think studio heads genuinely think in a very neoliberal way that they're doing a good thing. It's specialization in its best form. Race horror is popular now, so buy race horror ideas and just hire whichever non-white filmmaker brought it to you or are available to make it happen. The studio gets inclusion points for both subject matter and on-set demographics, and the filmmakers get a prestige item on their resumes. Why, race horror is a rising tide that lifts all ships. And even better, if the filmmakers you're hiring aren't white, but the movie ends up being trash anyway, no one can call you racist. The industry wants you to think it's being very generous and progressive by doing this. The story they're telling is that race horror never existed before now. Jordan Peele, visionary that he is, has invented a new subgenre, race horror. What an important new cultural era he has ushered us into, and Hollywood, ever generous, is here to help it reach its full potential. The problem with that narrative is that it is, to use the accepted academic term, utter horseshit. Race horror has always existed. Black horror in particular has a very long history beginning in earnest after the civil rights era more or less put an end to segregated movie theaters, where white people watched white movies and black people watched black movies, and if you're neither black nor white, you just watch movies wherever you don't get kicked out, I guess. Movies like Blackula and Ganja and Hess are usually categorized as blaxploitation, which, while not inaccurate, is a reminder of how narrow the cultural allowance for black film was in America, given that those films, Ganja and Hess especially, are thoughtful and sophisticated pieces of filmmaking despite having been made on shoestring budgets because Hollywood didn't want to give very much money to non-white productions. They were seen as unrelatable, since the audience is always white. So non-white people had to just wait around for a real risk-taking white director to try something new. That's how we got Night of the Living Dead and The People Under the Stairs, both of which surprised and divided audiences by having black protagonists who are never forced to explain what they're doing starring in a movie that white people might see. Those were very much outliers, though, made by horror directors who didn't shy away from experimentation because they're horror directors. If you're not white before, say, 2015, the only way you get to be in a high-dollar, mass-marketed production is by either being a sidekick, a stereotype, a victim, Will Smith, or some combination of the four, and then thanking Hollywood for the representation. And I think it's worth noting that I'm far from the first person to realize this trend, both before and after the boom that Get Out created. Black critics and cultural commentators have been very outspoken about this. I've quoted some of them in this video. What I think is interesting is that even after the proven success of Get Out, due to its speaking specifically to a non-white experience, the industry just doesn't seem to care about what non-white people want to see. And that wouldn't be such a problem. It's just more of the same, except that it makes the real-life discourse surrounding race actively worse. Here's an illustration of what I mean. A couple years ago, I made a video comparing John Carpenter's version of The Thing to the remake made in 2011, and a comment that keeps popping up is that I'm not recognizing the real problem with the 2011 Thing, which is that it has a female protagonist. Unqualified, just lady protagonists are wrong and unnatural for a horror movie. Unless they're being constantly victimized, female protagonists are just inappropriate, I guess. This comment is very funny to me because in that video, I directly address how the parameters of Mary Elizabeth Winstead's character in that movie are defined by her gender, and the reason that sucks. Because the way she's written privileges sexual politics over the existential horror the Thing is supposed to represent. Having a female protagonist is only categorically a problem if you think women can't have any possible function or agency outside their appeal to men. That's why I don't respond to those comments, and it's also why I consider the writing of that character a feminist issue. By writing her with a bias towards sexual politics in a movie where sexual politics has nothing to do with the story, the producers of that movie provided tacit evidence to misogynists who think that women are by nature boring and dumb. Similarly, one of the things that started to happen in response to this race horror trend is that right-wing trolls are using it as an example of Hollywood leftism, right? Horror, along with everything else, is becoming too woke. The wokeness is ruining movies. See what happens when you make minorities the main character? It just makes everything boring and bad. I mean, to be fair, some of them would say that even if every non-white horror movie or show was a masterpiece. But the point remains, the current iteration of race horror is not helping. The biggest injustice here is that the film industry's race horror problem is incredibly easy to fix. Let's think about what purpose horror serves as a mode of entertainment. All horror at its core is thematically about anxiety. You watch your most absurd fears manifested on a screen and you feel better because since someone else made this thing, that means they have demons too. And so maybe you're not as alone as you thought you were. This is one of the many ways horror and comedy are similar. You're experiencing a very human thing, fear and laughter, as a result of engaging with something that other humans made. And if it's made well, then that's a couple hours well spent. A large part of what's wrong with these movies is that they aren't any goddamn fun. They feel like an assignment. Jordan Peele is a comedian first, and part of what makes Get Out so great is the comedic undertone to everything that's happening. The expressions on Daniel Kaluuya's face as he bears witness to all this weird white people shit. The revolutionary thing that Jordan Peele did as an artist wasn't to write about Black issues. It was to say that the horror of racism partly comes from its absurdity. Think about it. The social structure of the entire modern world has been largely influenced by entirely arbitrary judgments from hundreds of years ago based on skin color. And even though that could be changed at any time, and even though everybody with two brain cells to rub together knows it's stupid and based off nothing and makes us all act like total goobers, we all have to deal with it anyway. That's very funny. And this is important because when race horror removes fun, entertainment, imagination, humor, and everything else that makes a movie even marginally engaging past superficially good cinematography, what we're left with is decontextualized displays of non-white pain and despair, otherwise known as exploitation. So with that in mind, here it is. The solution. The one weird trick to make your race horror win awards and lots of money. You gotta alienate white people. You have to make white people feel like they're not quite in on the joke. Make them feel like this movie isn't really for them. If you do it right and make it fun, I promise you, white people will watch it anyway. Even if they can't personally identify with the in-jokes of what racism feels like, because most people think racism is stupid. And if you need proof that white audiences will be cool with this, well, everyone thought Get Out was pretty good. Remember? That movie you keep trying to copy? In 1915, D.W. Griffith made Birth of a Nation, a stylistic masterpiece that made millions of people's lives worse. It was instrumental in setting a standard of race portrayal in mass-marketed film that went more or less unchallenged until extremely recently, where white people are assumed to be a neutral audience, unadorned by any cultural exoticisms and easily scared off by anything they can't personally relate to. And that idea, that assumption that all important cultural messages must either be instructive to or mediated through white people, is the mean to which the film industry regresses. Intention is a difficult thing to determine just through circumstantial evidence, but just to be clear, I don't think this is a result of overt racism on the film industry's part, at least in most cases. It's more insidious than that. The corporatocracy of Hollywood has strong incentives to support the existing status quo, which means that if it produces something truly progressive, it's by accident. Non-white people getting more top-billed creative work in the film industry is an unqualified good, but that doesn't mean that we get to ignore the ways a history of ingrained racism and cultural expectations hamstrings the kinds of stories that are able to be told. Offering oneself up for exploitation is not the price non-white creatives should pay to have their movies made. Not only that, but this is horror we're talking about. There's something deeply cynical and gross about shielding the ego of the assumed white audience in a genre where the point is to have a bad time. The problem is that there's a particular kind of bad time that throughout the history of pop culture has been off limits for white people. The understanding as you watch someone who looks like you get killed first, get dehumanized, or warped into the butt of a joke, that the people who run the culture industry don't really give a shit what you think or feel. Let white people see their identities and experiences unreflected in a movie for once. Just as a thought experiment. I promise you they will be okay. But I will say to the film executives who are no doubt watching my video with rapt attention, if you can't do this, if you can't bring yourselves to make a movie that's unrelatable to white people, then you have much bigger pathologies than concern over where your next paycheck is coming from. That might be a little abstract for movie executives, so I'll put it in a way you might understand better. Start alienating white people in your race horror movies, or you'll get the most nightmarish outcome of all. You'll waste a bunch of money on this trend only to never see it make $250 million again. Spooky.